Police Minister Bheki Cele says his department has spent close to 600 million rand to better equip the public order policing units, in line with recommendations by a panel of experts. Will this deal with heavy-handed policing, though? Let's find out. I'm joined by Gareth Newham from the Institute for Security Studies to help us with some of these answers. Gareth, thanks for your time. We appreciate it. So the police minister is insisting that police will continue using rubber bullets, but they'll be sent for more training. I thought that was already done.
Yes, good afternoon. The police are trained, but I think what the panel of experts on policing and crowd management found is that there are not inadequate standards against which the police are trained when it comes to the use of rubber bullets. So whereas the national instructions relating to the use of this kind of weaponry says it must only be used as an absolute last resort and on command of an officer that's at the scene, who's commanding the scene, and then directed only at very specific people who are about to commit an act of violence against another person or property, and other attempts to try and prevent this from taking place have already been tried and failed. So that's what the kind of national instruction says. But when it comes to training, too often the police officials are just trained on how to load the shotgun with the rubber bullets and then to discharge it. And also the kind of ammunition that they're being given, because the various kinds of rubber bullets are sometimes inadequate for precision shooting. In other words, they will ricochet, they'll bounce off, or they'll go in a direction away from where the police officer is shooting unless they're very close to the person. So we find that the police officers are tending to, in many cases, be ill-equipped, first of all, and second of all, not necessarily following the instructions as they are meant to be followed. And then thirdly, if they don't follow instructions, they're not necessarily always being debriefed properly or being held accountable if they deliberately ignore these instructions. So there's a range of issues that have to change before we would see real meaningful improvements.
Yeah, will have to change and training will have to happen, right? But that doesn't mean that we're going to see more heavy-handed policing over the next couple of weeks, especially since we have protests so often in South Africa, the student protests being case in point.
Yes, I mean, it is important to recognize that the police officials are dealing with quite a large number of protests across the country, some of which turn violent or disruptive, most of which are generally peaceful. And in many instances, the police don't necessarily act in a heavy-handed way. So there's been many instances where the police have actually shown a lot of restraint, have had good commanders on the ground. So it's not a situation the police, in all circumstances, in all of these public order units, are necessarily being heavy-handed. But I think we do need to make sure that there's a very clear standard against which all officers are expected to adhere, and certainly that where officers are being heavy-handed are not either familiar with or adhering to the regulations and to the national instructions, that action is taken, because it's undermining those that do.
Yeah. So let's talk a bit more about the consequences of these actions. We see the IPID, the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, taking these people to court. But what happens then? Because it seems like these police officers are not afraid when they pull that trigger without any warrant.
Well, when police officers are not afraid, in other words, they just do it in front of witnesses or people who are filming them, it means that they've become routinely used to not being held accountable for how they use their rubber bullets and their less than lethal weaponry. So then it takes a tragedy like a death or really a severe injury to lead to action being taken against them. The Independent Police Investigative Directorate will investigate any cases where it comes to their be brought to them. But we also know that the Independent Investigative Directorate is very under-resourced and doesn't have the capability to deal with the large and many thousands of cases that come their way. So a study last year found that out of 42,000 formally reported cases against police officers, only 5% end in either any kind of sanction for the officer that acted unlawfully. 1% end in a criminal conviction and 4% in disciplinary convictions. So 95% of the police officers who act in a way that give rise to a formal report to the IPID do not have a sanction issued against them and could continue acting badly. So there's obviously a real need to improve IPID. But also it's not the Independent Police Investigative Directorate's responsibility to make sure that police officers behave. That is the direct and legal responsibility of top management of the South African Police Service. So there's certainly a lot more that needs to be done in terms of not only training, but making sure that only the best people are recruited into the police, put in these units, are properly resourced, And for example, every year there's an assessment about our units dealing with crowd management. Are they properly trained? Are they properly resourced? Are they being held accountable? Do we have the right people in these units? So it's going to take more of an effort from top management in the police to really ensure that we see the back of this kind of heavy-handed incidents that lead to the kinds of tragedies we've seen recently.
Yeah, and of course we've been talking about this for a long time. The 2012 Marikana massacre will come to mind. There were, of course, the Farlam Commission investigated that. We're finally seeing recommendations being read out by the police minister today. Given that we've been struggling to deal with this issue for so many years, I mean, what hope do we actually have that it's going to finally be resolved?
Well, I think with the release of this report today and with the pressure that's being placed on the police and the police minister in recent times because of the recent death of Mr. Matumba, for example, there's a growing realization that things have to change, that we cannot carry on as usual or carry on in the way we've been going before. So I think there's certainly, hopefully, a growing political recognition of this. But I still think that we need to really start looking at some of the more far-reaching recommendations related to how do we ensure that we only have the best possible women and men in the South African Police Service, and certainly at the top management echelon. So we have 199 generals in the South African Police Service. It would be useful to do an analysis to know, do we need that many generals? Are all those generals performing their functions to the best of their abilities? How are they appointed? Because we know we have many excellent generals, but we also know that over many years of politicization, of poor leadership appointments in terms of the National Commissioner, those appointments have led to other poor appointments. So ideally we would start rejuvenating the top leadership of the South African Police Service to make sure that only the most highly skilled, highly experienced men and women of impeccable integrity occupy a position of general, and then put them in charge of a very clear reform program to say exactly how you're going to improve recruitment, training, resourcing, motivation, recognition, rewards, and of course holding police officers who act badly accountable, because all those areas do need reform and do need improvement. But it can only happen when you have the best possible top management echelon.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time and your insight. Gareth Newham from the Institute for Security Studies.